No, you're live.
Good afternoon. I'm Gloria Nelson with TUG. And as you settle in and get ready for the start of today's webinar, let me give a brief introduction for TUG, the usergroup.org, for both our current members and those of you who represent organizations that have not yet joined our Infor community of online distribution users. We all heard the phrase knowledge is power, and I can say with confidence that after today's presentation, you'll be waking up tomorrow with a little more of both. And today is but one of our many, many presentations. TUG webinars, online forums, and member events facilitate the timely exchange of ideas and information to help you work smarter and with more confidence. And that is a powerful combination. If you're currently a member, it pays to get even more involved. And if you're not, please visit our website to discover why 2,300 heads are better than one to help you be the best at what you do. With today's content, I just want to let you know that the intellectual property is graciously being shared, and you can feel free to take screenshots and also copy chat as it rolls by your screen. And it is our pleasure to welcome each one of you to the TUG Connects 365 Facts Friday today. Ralph Wallace with Sequoia joins us today to share his wealth of knowledge. And Ralph, I'm turning things over to you now.
Great, thank you, Gloria. All right, let me share my screen. Well, hello, everyone. I've done many pricing presentations over the years, but usually they were in the form of an update. So what has changed? And some time back, I got a request to say, Ralph, can you put everything together? So I'd like to see a comprehensive presentation that really focuses on every single aspect of pricing. And I had to smile as I put it together. Even I had forgotten a few of the little corners that the Facts offers. Now, this is a lot of content here, so I'm going to go fairly quickly, but if you'd like a copy of the slide deck, I'll have my email information at the end, and I'll be happy to send that to you. So here's the outline of what we're going to talk about today, and I think before we get into the how, let's begin with why, and then we can get into all the various sections within pricing found in the Facts product today. So in terms of goals, there are many, and I'm not going to read the list here, but I think it's important for every company to have pricing set up, to have at least a template or a framework of where you want to be. Now, that's not to say you would lack the flexibility. I know a number of distributors do have the ability for their salespeople to adjust pricing, but I think you still need to have something fixed and set up on paper. I have one customer where I was quite surprised. They had none involved. So literally every pricing decision was made on the fly by their salespeople. And that created a number of challenges downstream. Now, here is my recommended process. So today, what I want you to do is learn. And there may be aspects of the system that you'd like to change. So the suggestion is to take those new ideas and within your company, review that and maybe set up a flip chart and see how that might work into your sales process and discuss how you want to go about doing that. Now, here's a caution. Some of the things I'm going to show you, especially in the setup screens, can potentially create problems. So don't change anything without first working with your partner or your support person. Now, there may be a couple of things like changing a label that isn't critical, but I still urge you to work with your partner and get their advice in terms of how to implement, especially if it's a fairly big change to what you're currently using today. One of the things I found, this goes back to my comment, is that a lot of distributors, and a study found by in Texas A&M was a lot of distributors just basically flip a coin. So as I mentioned, come up with a plan and consider stratification. And that's a topic. I know Ernest & Associates has a great product about pricing stratification where you're looking at the value of various customers and items in order to determine what is the ideal pricing for those combinations. Certainly other considerations, how frequently they purchase from you, the margins that you have. In fact, there's now even pricing science, the whole notion of how you should arrive at it. But in all cases, really think about how it is you want to arrive at your base pricing. Another good place to begin is knowing your cost. I think that's an essential starting point, and it certainly helps to use automation. Now, FACS had electronic price updates, which introduced, I guess it was version 6.5 or 6.4 back in 1995. And I'll confess, it was a little bit user hostile. It was difficult to implement. It didn't understand Excel, and it was possible really to do some damage. Today, however, there is a great program that works on Excel, and it feeds information into your system, into the suggested pricing. It's found there on the pricing menu, the update suggested costs and prices. So if you're not updating your costing for your vendors electronically, I recommend that you look at doing so. And certainly most companies today can provide that kind of output into a spreadsheet or a flat file. But it's always good to have the right answer to start in terms of determining what your pricing is going to be. So there are 5 different dimensions of pricing, and we'll visit each one of them. Some may not be as significant as others, but certainly I just want to let you know all of the various areas in which it's involved. So let's start with level pricing. Now here's setup. As I mentioned, this is one of the initial business rule or so-called IC static screens. So this is a screen you may not have visited or done recently, but this is where everything really begins. So one of the things here, if you'll notice towards the top, is the notion of how many levels do you want to use? So you can use 1 through 6, and there's also a 7th one, which is standard price. So actually, there are 7 different levels all told. Another option there's a checkbox below there as to whether or not you want to require descending prices. So the notion being that, say, level 0 might be list price or your highest price. And then as you start moving down, price level 1 is lower than 0. Price level 2 is lower than that. Sometimes having that progression can be easier to maintain. Also below there is the question of the price mask. And a mask is simply the format of what decimal precision you require. Now, my recommendation is to just use penny resolution. Now, I know in some cases you may say, well, gee, Ralph, I need to break it down into mils because we sell maybe smaller items. It could be washers or small electronic parts where the pricing might require something finer. There, my recommendation, and we'll talk about it a little later, might be to set your pricing on a different unit of measure. So instead of being per each, you might price it per dozen or per 1,000, or something like that. Another element is down below. Here are labels, and I see a lot of distributors where if you look into item inquiry, if you look at when you print your labels, they haven't been changed out of just being the labels that you see delivered from the installation, just level 3 and so forth. But here is where you can put some structure. So if you'll notice, I'm for standard, I made that list, and then level 1, retail, small contractor, large contractor. But this is something that might be helpful for your people to be able to use or to look and to see if that's involved here. Now I see there is a chat. See if there's anything I need to double check here. Let me just take a quick look there. Oh, yeah, so if you have any questions, Gloria will be monitoring those, and certainly we can be able to, we'll answer those at the end of the session, time permitting, and if not, then certainly I'll be happy to answer any questions you might send in later. So this is, again, one of the setup screens in inventory static. Whoops, let me back up here. I was trying to clear my chat bubble. Now here we're into the sales order setup screen, sales order static, and here is another thing that comes into play, price order. Within the systems, pricing can come from a number of different directions. It can be level-based, it can be quantity-based, or it can use contract pricing, all of which we'll go into more detail. So the question becomes, which one takes precedence over the other? So if you'll look, here are the various choices that you have, whether it's just standard price or list, as we look into levels and breaks and contracts. Now, the way FACS works is it reads from the left to the right. So in this example, with the C being first, what it would do is say, let me look, are there any contract-based pricing for this customer buying this particular item? If so, it'll stop there and it will use the pricing that it finds. If not, then it'll continue the search. So in this case, it would look on to level. Do I find that this customer has a particular level? Once again, if not, it would move on to quantity-based pricing. So this allows you to let the system prioritize and walk through what are potentially a lot of different ways to find the answer to that question. Now, there's another possibility called lowest price. Now, let me be clear, lowest price is not the lowest price found in your system that you would send to anyone. It would be the lowest price that you would sell to this customer based upon their level, any quantity breaks in your system, and any contracts that would apply to them. Now, there's one thing you must do in order for this to work. You must put the X in the beginning of the list. So in here, it's really out of play. It's at the back end of it. But in order for the system to essentially look at all the possibilities, what you need to do is put that, again, that character X at the beginning of the price order. Now, similarly, we talk about contracts. There's also a hierarchy because contracts can be have different bases. It can be very broad or it can be very specific. So there is a program on the SO5 menu, the contract pricing, where you establish this particular this priority. And effectively, what you're doing is you have two things to determine: the customer scope and then the item scope. Likewise, we're going to read from left to right. So in this example, it's going to look at item-based pricing first. The C would be on a customer, excuse me, individual. So as I look at the customer, an individual customer, this would be a customer class, and then finally would be all customers. As we look at the item scope, similarly, now it would be an individual item, all those that belong to an item-based class based on vendors, and then after that, all. So you can control the order in which you want to do that. Once you've filled in these two forms, then Fax will populate this list. So this is kind of like playing poker. Customer item in this case, that would be a royal flush. So that would take precedence over everything. So typically, a more specific item will take precedence over a very general one. And general ones could be used for promotional pricing, where you might say, well, for the month of December, we will have a promotion based on a product line or a vendor, something of that basis. Now it is here where you'll notice to the left, this is our customer file maintenance, and it is here we assign a customer to both a customer class and a customer price class. Now there is a big difference here. The customer class is used primarily for reporting and really is not involved with pricing. The second one, though, the customer price class, this is designed specifically for use for pricing. And I see a lot of distributors set these exactly the same value. And if you notice, even in my demo world, we're using the same codes, but you certainly don't have to do that. So each of these codes is set up to really answer a different kind of question. And then similarly, when you go into the item master or the item file maintenance, you have the same choice. So here, this is where you would assign an item-based price class. So overall, the objective is to be able to price at a higher level where you don't have to have as many exceptions. So to the extent that you have items that have a similar gross margin structure, or they vary by some attribute, by color, something like that, then you can use the similar pricing for all of those items that may be very similar. Now, another concept is multiple units of measure, and this was introduced long ago. So here is another way that you can promote selling a greater quantity of an item. So as a starting point, pretty much everyone has an each, but you may sell some products. You might sell, it might be a box, you might have a carton or a pallet, something like that. Pricing can likewise be specific to the unit of measure. And I mentioned that especially if you're selling items of very low pricing, then this might be a way to take advantage of that and eliminate the rounding problem. Or if you use, going back to that price mask, if you go 3 decimals to the right, or if you go 3 positions to the right of the decimal, then you sacrifice having 1 to the left. So for every item, you have a default pricing unit of measure. But if you'll notice here, I do have 2 of them, each in carton. You can determine whether pricing is valid for that particular unit of measure. So which pricing method? And there are 2 different ways, and it's not a decision you have to make globally. These decisions can be made literally down to the item, just as it applies. So one of them is fixed pricing. And these are ideal for items that are stable, where you want to make sure that there's not much change. So you set a given price for an item. All right, it's $9.95, or it's 50 cents each. That is good because customers like consistency. So every time you sell that item, it will be at the same price. Now, a challenge though, if your pricing is set for a period of time, for say a year or 6 months, something like that, that potentially there could be some margin shrinkage. So if the cost underneath is changing, then that might affect your cost. So your margin on selling that. So that might be one consideration, to use a fixed method. On the other hand, you can make it dynamic. And these are good for commodity items where maybe the customer expects that the price will change as costing fluctuates, as demand fluctuates, and pricing ends up being really a moving target. But the good element there is when it's dynamic, you're basing it on either a list minus or a cost plus. You can be assured a particular margin. So these are questions that, again, you can use in conjunction with, say, price classes or an item price class, where those items might have some similarity. So you don't have to use one method for all items. Use them as it applies or as it makes sense to all of what you sell. Also the basis. So when we talk about dynamic, it changes, but what is the starting point? And that is the basis. So one can be cost plus. And in that situation, you can start from manual cost. Now, manual cost itself is fixed, and it's typically used for purchasing purposes, but it is a reference. It usually also can be where, if you're importing costs electronically from your vendors, typically you would be updating the manual cost as what would be the next acquisition cost for you. It also could be what we call SO cost, or sales order cost. This is based upon the valuation you've chosen in your system, which could be average or last or FIFO or LIFO. In other words, what is the accounting cost that you're using currently in your system? Then the other might be starting with list price, and then might be a discount off of that. So depending upon your market or the types of products that you have, maybe list price is commonly known, and that's published by your vendors, or maybe in catalogs of your competitors. So there, what you might do is say, all right, we will give you list minus 10% or list minus 20% or whatever is an appropriate value. Let's talk about setting up new items. New item setup is very important, and I trust that you have a process for doing that. Also, certain people in terms of how you go through the setting up a new item. Now, when you do that, it establishes your list price, your manual cost, any levels that might apply, as well as any quantity breaks that you are setting up for this given item. Now, another tool that you can use is, just as when you set up a new item, is that you can set as a default. So you can choose one item to help you set up a new one. That helps with consistency, and it does. There is some that also moves forward into the pricing arena as well. So especially if there are items that are very similar, an attribute might vary by maybe a color or a finish, or maybe even a size, something like that. It could make it easier for you to use an existing item in order to help set up another. And then you'll notice on the screen here, now this is really not going to be a training sort of element, but there are a lot of different ways you can do that. Here again, it can be a fixed pricing where you're saying here is the answer, or it can be dynamic, where you're establishing a basis and a multiplier. Oh, let me also mention too, there is a quick add. So there's the ability to very quickly set up an item without going through every field, but it does allow you to replicate an item and make it into your system pretty quickly. All right, now sometimes level pricing, when we've got only 7 different answers, may not be enough. And back in the 80s, when I was running Fax 1, we needed a lot more answers. We were selling to a lot of different restaurant chains, and what we sold to Chick-fil-A varied from McDonald's and Burger King and everyone else. So I just used a brute force sort of thing, and I ended up having 20 levels. Well, that really wasn't sophisticated. Contracts are designed to fill that gap. So it handles all of the exceptions where the levels or the quantity breaks may not apply. Another nice thing is it's date-based. So it's good for promotions. So you can say, all right, well, for a period of time, for a month or a week, or you might say, all right, so maybe after Christmas. So for the month of January, then we're having a promotion on all of our Christmas supplies. Or again, you can do it however you want. The scope is very flexible. So you can, and here again, this is where setting up your item or price classes can be very helpful. So rather than having to set up exceptions, this customer buying this item for everything, to the extent that you can generalize, you can say, okay, I have 5 or 6 different customers who are very similar. So I'll set up a contract that applies to all of them. I had a customer once years ago in the Florida area, and I was shocked to discover they had literally 50,000 contracts, and all of them were customer item specific, and essentially it was just unmanageable. They just had far too many. So the objective here is to set up as few records in order to achieve your sales and marketing goals. Another thing is it's aware of the type of item. So for example, whether it is a direct ship or a non-stock. So once again, if you are trying to, let's say you're trying to get rid of some surplus stock, what you're trying to do is promote selling what you already have and not what you would have to buy. So you could say this contract only applies to items that are currently stocked, and it would not apply to any special order items, or if we were to get those from the vendor and ship them directly to you. Also, there's rounding. As we get into also the level price, there's simple rounding, but here there's custom rounding, and that's an entire discussion of itself. But you can do it like you see on TV. You can have everything at 95 cents, or you can have it based upon, round up to a nickel or a dime or a quarter, however you want to do that. Now, another area has to do with quotes. And here we have a little bit of a chicken or the egg question. So which do you start first? Do you create a contract and then create a quote that's based upon that? Or in some cases, we've had the request where setting up a quote can actually create a simple customer and item-based contract. Now, certainly this is something that we understand. Setting up contracts could be a sensitive item. We may not want every salesperson to do it. So here's a great case where you can use the field-based security. So that's something you can do and say, all right, well, maybe we will allow some of our salespeople do it, but maybe not allow everyone to make that particular element. And oops, sorry, I went back too far. Let me mention too that as you look at the lines within a quote, there's now a new item or a new element. So there is the question of whether or not that item has been converted to a quote, also whether or not that item has been converted to a contract. So there are the 2 different ways that you can see how a quote can be involved in creating an order or also in creating a simple contract. Now, contract has evolved. Today we're in what I will call version 3.0. Version 1 was very limited, and version 2 came about, it was probably about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. And some of the feedback was, well, we took about 3 steps forward, but maybe took 1 step back. And one of the limitations was that even in setting up a fairly simple contract, you had to go to about 3 different screens. Dana Nelson was the product manager at that time, so she went back, fine-tuned the design there. So what you have now is a series of new capabilities, and one of which is the quick contract entry. So what that allows you to do in a single screen to set up a simple contract. Typically, this would be for a customer item. So where you don't need all of the capabilities within the, what I'll call the full capability setup, here there is the ability to set up one very quickly if that is your need. So here we go to the overall setup here. And there are a lot of different elements here. Here's where you set up the dates, the effective and end date, whether this is for setting up levels or quantity breaks. And a contract can do that as well. So you can assign a unique quantity break system for a given customer or for a particular series of items that might differ from the standard quantity break system that is based on one particular item. There's also the notion of full scope. So in this case, it would be for, you could say, all right, I'm going to set up a contract for one or more customers, but it applies to all items. Or conversely, you might say this applies to all customers, but then you might vary the scope of the particular items. So these would be used typically in promotional sort of situations where the contract may only be for a limited period of time. Now, in every case, I suggest that you never put the expiration date as never. Never say never. It makes it more difficult to maintain. And you'll see later when we talk about creating collections, it is far easier to maintain them and to see when they might need to be reviewed when you establish an expiration date. Now, it could be a year in advance or 2 years, whatever, but I do recommend strongly you set up an expiration date for every contract. You also, as I mentioned earlier, it can exclude certain items. So in this case, if you look across here, if your objective is to clean out some surplus stock here, you might say, I will exclude this from any non-stocked items or from any particular, if this is a direct ship sort of thing. So, and of course, you also can look at catalog as another way of saying non-stock, uninventoried. Of course, those are billing instruments, might be something like a delivery fee or pallet charge, something like that. And there's also where you would select a rounding formula from the codes that you've already set up. So first element is customer scope, and that simply answers the question, which customers? So that can be a specific customer, and you can have a collection. You can say, well, it's these two customers. You can cherry pick a list. It can be those who belong to a customer price class, or it can apply to all. And because this is essentially a line item based element, you can have multiple answers. So you can say this applies to those customers within a particular price class, and I want to add these 3 individual customers as well. So it can be, the scope can be however you want to do it. Now, another functionality here is that it can be based upon a ship to. So think of a ship to might be an individual project. So if you've got a customer and you're working on an individual project, the pricing might be specific to only that particular ship to. Now, as we move into item scope, there's a lot more complexity here because there are more ways that you can describe a particular item. So we begin with a similar question of, it can be a specific item, those that belong to a particular price class, or in this case, those that belong to a particular vendor. Now, as we start looking and we answer the question, is this going to be a fixed price or is it going to be dynamic? We're doing the basis multiplier. One thing that sometimes trips people up is that think about another dimension of items, unit of measure. So if your objective is to set up a fixed price, then also when you put in an individual item, you must also select a particular unit of measure, because you wouldn't want to say, all right, well, I'm going to sell a particular item for $1, whether that customer buys 1 or a box of 10. So just remember that if you are going to use fixed pricing, then remember that at the scope, when you put in the item, you must also indicate the unit of measure for that particular fixed pricing. Then when we get to the final question, how much is it? Here you have all of the capabilities. So with that, you would establish then, is this a fixed price? What is that value? Or basis multiplier, then you have all of the various choices below that. And then one thing you'll find too is that As you start establishing each level, or you go down in each level, you'll have fewer choices. So in other words, level 3 can be then a basis of 2 or 1, and then 4 can be, so you get a different scope for each one. Let's talk about collections. And this is a new feature that was added, and again, what I'll call Contracts 3.0. What it allows you to do is group like contracts, and this is great for maintaining them. It could be an ability to establish them by salesperson, or you might have multiple individuals who are responsible for a given number of contracts. This is also where the question of expiration date can be very helpful, because at any time you could go in and then say, all right, well, I want to look at a collection. In this case, I'm going to look at Ralph's here, my particular contracts, and you'll see both effective and expiration date. And also, like a lot of particular presentations and facts, you can click on this and it'll sort them. So here, this is a list view, and you can sort them to see which ones are coming up for review very soon. Another nice thing is the ability to export results or to import them using Excel. Now, you can't start creating contracts via Excel, but you can maintain them. So once you've established a contract and then you have attached to it to a collection, then you can export these to Excel. From there, you can then maintain them, make any kind of changes you want, and then once you're done, then you can import them back into the system. So that is a great way to maintain them and use the power of Excel if you need to do some what ifs and margin analysis, all the various things you can do within Excel. And then certainly as you create these collections, you give them a name, and you can have as many collections as you require. Once again, a great way to group them, and it makes it a whole lot easier for maintaining large numbers of contracts. Chaining. Now, here's another great capability. We like history, and another question has to come up with a historical perspective of pricing of customers over time. So a chain is simply a copy of an existing contract. So when a contract is coming up for changing, maybe it's the end of the year, you need new pricing, you could just edit the existing contract the night before, or just immediately before it comes in, before it's effective. But a more elegant way, however, is to chain. What that does, it creates a copy. So then what you're able to do is then edit that copy. And in that copy, you can change the content. It can be whether it's the customer content, it's the item content, anything that you see fit can be changed within that copy. So another nice thing too is allows you to set that up in advance. So you could say, all right, we're now working, we're in December, let's go ahead and start working on our pricing that's going to be effective starting in January or even in March. So you can set up the chain and say, all right, it is effective in March, take all the time you need to set up that pricing. So then both of the contracts will be out there, and the effective date will determine when that new contract becomes effective. Another nice thing is that once you create the chain, then it has what I'll call a date type seal. So let's say that the original contract expired, say, December 31st of 2021, and you go ahead and create that chain. Well, maybe you might decide later that, well, the effective date, let's back it up. Let's say that is effective through maybe 12/20 of 2021. Well, rather than having an apparent gap between the original expiration date and the effective date of the chain will automatically change the effective date of the copy. So it'll make sure that they're really back to back. There never is a time between one or the other contract is not effective. So the chaining process is pretty easy. You start with an existing one, and then it's just simply a menu item from within contract maintenance where you say, I want to create a chain of that contract. You also can give it a new description. There may be some different pricing involved with that, or a different grouping of customers, or maybe it's a new vendor promotion. However you want to describe that, you can give it that new description. And then, of course, you can come up with its effective and expiration date. And here again, don't make this or do give it an expiration date other than never. And then you can say whether or not I want to merge those together. Now, another bit of pricing was introduced in the end of 7.5, and that's when storefront came into being. So this was intended to work with e-commerce, although it certainly isn't limited to that. But what it allows you to do is to set up freight based upon particular groups, and it's kind of like a quantity break sort of a relationship. So what you can do is you can say, well, if you buy, say, if your order value is, say, up to $50, then we'll charge $10 of freight. Or if you want to say, well, if you buy $100 worth of goods, then you free freight. So it can be based on price. It can be based upon weight if you're selling very heavy items, or it could be the item count. So you could say, well, if you buy at least 20 different items, then that can govern the pricing. And again, you can set up multiple tiers, each with a cutoff, determine and what that particular value for freight is. So this is yet another way to do pricing that can be based upon this simple formula without having to use a system where each and every order has its unique value. Certainly too, you can maybe enjoy some markup and provide some extra margin by having a little extra profit built into your freight pricing. So let's talk about maintaining levels. Now they can be done three different ways. It can be done one by one, which is the first choice here, suggested cost price entry. There is the second one is to allow to do it for a range of items, and there are a lot of different ways you can do it. And then finally, the import, and that's where you're pulling in the usually the costing based upon some information that your vendor has already sent you. So in the suggested cost price entry, it is here where you start with your effective date, and then it's here where we determine, is this a fixed value or is it is a basis multiplier. So this would be for a given item, what are the values? So again, it could be for either, in this case, we're looking at, these are quantity breaks, but it could also be for establishing the levels. So you could do either one up to the number of levels that you've got established in your system. Here's a very important thing to understand. Once you create suggestions by any of those ways, there are programs to do, there is a delete versus erase, and the distinction is very important. Delete, erase, it removes what you already have. So let's say that you already have 6 different levels for an item, and what you want to do are remove 3 of those levels. That would be an example of a delete. It will actively change what is already set up in your system. Erase, however, is to say, oh, oops, I created some suggestions and I made a mistake. I shouldn't have done that. Erase simply removes things from the suggestion so that there will be no change. So again, very important distinction there. Now here's the second program where you can create your cost, or you can update price, change the manual cost or list price by a factor. And you can do it for a range of items. So it can be a range of items by the vendor, by the item number, by the class. Now, one thing, however, is that you can get yourself in trouble. By default, every single item, every aspect is turned on. And if you notice, it is a basis multiplier of 0. It is possible if you click OK that you would create suggestions to completely clobber your entire price file. And I had a customer actually do that. They updated these. Fortunately, they had a good backup. Here's a recommendation. Create what I call a safe template. A template, if you recall, it's simply a collection of answers. So make a template where all you're doing is changing one thing, like, standard price. And I just say basis multiplier of 1, which means that, well, really doesn't change anything. And make that the default template. So if anyone inadvertently stumbles in here and clicks OK, then really they can't cause any damage. So there are also the 2 other programs. This is where we can either erase, print, or update the entries. So here again, erase being, gee, I want to remove some suggestions I placed out there. Once you have suggestions, then it's certainly good to review them. So you can print those suggestions, as well as finally, when you're done, you can update them. Now here, the update or all of these can be very selective by the type of item, again, a range of things, as well as the cutoff date. Now here's a distinction. Contract pricing works automatically. You can have multiple contracts so that a chain contract would take effect automatically upon its effective date. Now here, there's an effective date, but you must necessarily update the suggestions in order for them to be live. So it does allow you to put the suggestions in advance. You'll see those within item inquiry, that those suggestions will become effective at a future date. But it also means that you could have suggestions going out there. Some might be applied, say, in January, some in February. So when you run the cutoff date, make sure you put in a good answer, like only those through the end of the year, only those through January 31st, 2021, so that other suggestions that are really waiting to be updated later will then remain until they really need to be effective. Where you see it in the inquiry, a couple different ways. Certainly within item inquiry, you can see for a given item all the various pricing, and whether there's whether it's basis multiplier. Also, it is here where you see those suggestions. Over in the customer inquiry, this is where you're answering the question, how much does it cost for a given customer buying a particular item? So here you can see where that is. Also, you can drill in to see if it's a contract, what is the basis for that. Also, you see within all of the sales order entries, there is a kind of a cryptic column, but is the basis. So you'll see here, is that a contract or is that a particular level? And if you allow your users to go in and do I think it's an F3 there, the what if pricing, then here you can also put in a margin if you allow them to see cost and do some what if pricing within here. Here again, that's something you can control via the field level security. Because we certainly understand costing is very sensitive in some environments, and you may not want everyone to be able to take a look at that or base their pricing based off of that. Now, another thing too is going back to that origin is that is stored in the past invoice file. As you drill into, in fact, an order, also in a past invoice, you can see how that price was arrived at. How did we get that element? And then you might see user override. Also, within the past invoice report. Now, the standard report doesn't choose this field, but if you remember, this is format or equipped. So you can create your own format and add that column, export it to Excel, and then certainly you can create slicers or sort, and you can see which salespeople or which items are being, or where those overrides are taking place. And once again, just a reminder here, all of this, it's easy to set up with your field level security, which can be based upon either a password and or a security code that you've assigned. Pricing for internal, it can be either horizontal or vertical. Again, that's just simply a different perspective here. And then there also is an external for the customer. So this is customer facing that can be printed or it can be exported. So you can send a spreadsheet to your customer so that they can import their pricing directly into their system to save them time. So you can send them a spreadsheet of the pricing that applies to them as well. So finally, wrapping up, what does standard fax not do? And there are three different categories that fall into that. One is the question of rebates. Now, maybe your partner, I know here we at Sequoia do have a rebate module that we've developed, but if that's something you might have to ask if you have that particular need. It's not only a pricing question, but also there's an accounting side because you have a contra cost of goods and then a vendor receivable. Family pricing. So this is a case where, if you go someplace and you can say, all right, well, we're going to sell pens. And if you buy 10 pens, that could be of any color. Maybe you can say, all right, I want some yellow, some red, or some blue. You might say, all right, if I buy 10 of that, then there might be a particular price. Now that involves looking at all of the line items of a sales order in order to do it. And I remember years ago, Tim Plochner in one of the technical training classes essentially built that modification. So it's something that's not terribly difficult, and your partner may already have that, development done if that's something that's important. And then finally, buy one, get one free. Here again, it's not a standard functionality, but would be something that wouldn't be terribly difficult to do. Think about companion items. So there is a standard functionality within the system where you can say, all right, if I buy a particular fixture, then you may want to suggest selling to them the lamps or maybe something else. Well, similarly, you could create a companion that could be essentially the second item is the same item itself, or if you buy one, you get one free. Now, out of the box, it would want to price that, but maybe a modification could be written in order to make that companion a free item if that's what you want to do. So here we are. This is the end of my presentation. So what I want to do here is open it up for any questions that might have been issued here.
I have not seen any questions populate so far, but I know that people can take a few moments possibly to type something into either chat or the Q&A bubble. As always, Ralph, you do such a wonderful job presenting, and your context is comprehensive, so appreciated. And also a reminder to everyone, if you want to request the slide deck that Ralph has presented today, simply email him at ralph.wallace@sequoiagroup.com, which is loaded on the slide in front of you. I don't see anything that's populating right now, not saying that it won't, but also you can feel free to email Ralph with any additional questions. So let me just get back to where I need to be and close out some things here. First of all, thank you, Ralph, so much for the great content and everyone who's been online joining us on the webinar. This is the last of our Facts Fridays for the calendar year, and we look forward to exciting programming continuing in 2021. Now, for those of you that might be contemplating a move to Cloud Suite distribution, we are going to be having an afternoon session today at 2 p.m. with Infor, presenting the Cloud Suite key highlights year in review. And also Unform is going to be presenting their technology on Cirrus Print, printing from the cloud, coming up on Tuesday. That will be our last webinar that's on the schedule for 2021 as well. TUG members, just a reminder, if you still have additional questions, you can either email Ralph or continue the conversation and post any additional questions, because I know he monitors those TUG forum boards that are exclusive to our members. So anyhow, continue the conversation in there. And for those of you who are not yet members, please visit www.theusergroup.org and join today. And on that note, Happy New Year, everyone. And we will see you next year. And as they say in Hollywood, that's a wrap.